My dear child, the enemies who celebrated your fall are about to witness your greatest rise, because the explosion they were applauding was never the ending of your trajectory, but the ignition of a propulsion system they did not understand. And the altitude being reached right now by what they ignited is going to be visible to every eye that watched the explosion and thought it was the last thing they would ever see from this launch pad. Do not scroll past this. What I am about to reveal is not about bouncing back from difficulty in the general spiritual sense. This is about a launch, a specific propulsion-driven. The explosion was the fuel. What looked like destruction was always the ignition launch that is happening right now on a launch pen the enemy's thought was a crash site, powered by the exact force they contributed to when they celebrated what they believed was your permanent ending. They celebrated the ignition. They thought it was the destruction. You have been using the memory of the celebration as a ceiling, the specific, internal. Remember what happened last time. Remember who watched. Remember what they said ceiling, that the humiliation of a publicly witnessed fall installs on a person whose lowest moment became entertainment for the people who resented the potential the fall interrupted. The ceiling has been governing how high you allow yourself to rise, keeping the trajectory below the altitude, where visibility would expose you to the same audience that applauded the explosion. My beloved child, the ceiling is about to be exceeded by a propulsion system whose fuel was the very celebration the ceiling was built from. The explosion they cheered was not the termination. It was the controlled detonation that produces the thrust, and the thrust is active. Stay here. What I reveal next is how much fuel the celebration actually added, and why the altitude this launch produces will exceed every point the celebration was designed to prevent you from reaching. Type ignition, not destruction, if your lowest moment was celebrated by people who wanted you to fail, and God just told you the explosion they applauded was never the ending but the ignition of a propulsion system they did not understand. And the altitude being produced right now by what they fueled is about to be visible to every eye that watched the explosion and thought it was the last thing they would ever see from this launch pad. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something that genuinely surprised me. A neuroscientist discovered a simple 7-second technique that actually rewires how your brain processes thoughts. And when I tried it, the difference was almost unsettling. My focus sharpened, ideas started connecting faster, and that mental fog gone. This isn't manifestation nonsense. It's backed by real brain science, and thousands of people are already seeing results. But here's the catch. Only 5 spots are left. If something inside you is saying, try it, trust that instinct. Click the link in the description or pinned comment before it's too late. Every person who celebrated the explosion was adding fuel to the propulsion chamber without knowing the chamber existed, which means the volume of fuel available for this launch is directly proportional to the volume of celebration the enemies produced when they believed they were witnessing an ending. My beloved child, I need you to understand how a rocket's propulsion system converts explosion into altitude. A controlled detonation produces thrust. Thrust produces lift. Lift produces altitude. The relationship between the detonation and the altitude is not despite. It is because. The rocket does not rise despite the explosion beneath it. The rocket rises because the explosion beneath it is the exact force the propulsion system was designed to convert from downward blast into upward trajectory. The explosion goes down. The rocket goes up. Same force, different direction. My dear one, every act of celebration the enemies performed was an act of fuel being deposited into a propulsion chamber they could not see. Every whispered conversation about your fall was fuel. Every satisfied smile when the news traveled was fuel. Every quiet enjoyment of your lowest moment by a person who resented the potential the moment interrupted was fuel being poured into a system whose conversion mechanics they had no awareness of. They poured fuel, believing they were pouring finality, and the system received every drop. This message was not released for everyone who has experienced opposition. This was aimed at the one person whose specific, publicly witnessed, celebrated by identifiable people fall produced a specific volume of fuel in a propulsion chamber that has been storing every drop of celebration for a launch whose altitude is proportional to the volume the enemies deposited. The person who does not know that the people who celebrated the hardest added the most fuel, and the most fuel produces the highest altitude. The hardest celebrators fueled the highest altitude, and the altitude is about to become visible. Type fuel converted. If every act of celebration was fuel being deposited into a propulsion chamber the enemies could not see, and the volume of fuel available for the launch is directly proportional to the volume of celebration the enemies produced, because the propulsion system converts the downward force of the explosion into the upward trajectory of the altitude, meaning the people who celebrated the hardest added the most fuel, and the most fuel is about to produce the highest altitude. I have been monitoring the propulsion chamber since the first drop of celebration fuel was deposited, and the monitoring has been the specific, engineer level. I know the volume in the chamber, and I know the altitude it produces. Attention of a god who designed the conversion system and has been watching the enemies pour fuel into a mechanism whose output they could not calculate because they did not know the mechanism existed. My dear one, not from mission control at a distance reviewing the fuel data remotely, from the launch pad, beside the rocket, standing at the propulsion system, the enemies were unknowingly fueling while they were celebrating what they believed was a permanent grounding of a trajectory they resented. I have been at the launch pad, measuring the fuel the entire time. My beloved child, I watched the specific celebration that deposited the largest volume of fuel. There was a person, a specific, identifiable, their celebration was the loudest person, whose enjoyment of your fall was not passive observation, but active participation. Their celebration was sustained. Their satisfaction was visible, and the sustained visibility of their satisfaction deposited a volume of fuel into the propulsion chamber that exceeded what any other celebrator contributed. Because sustained celebration produces sustained deposits, and sustained deposits produce proportional altitude. The loudest celebrator fueled the highest climb, and they have no idea. I chose you for this message because the propulsion chamber is full, not approaching full. The volume of fuel the celebrations deposited has reached the maximum the chamber can hold, and a full chamber on a launch pad whose countdown has been running since the explosion means the launch is not approaching. The launch is imminent. The countdown is in its final sequence, and the altitude the full chamber will produce exceeds every ceiling the memory of the celebration was installing on the trajectory. The humiliation was preventing you from attempting. My child, the countdown is single digits. The chamber is full, and the loudest celebrator's fuel is about to produce the highest altitude on the gauge. Type chamber full if God has been at the launch pad measuring the fuel since first celebration was deposited, and the specific person whose celebration was loudest contributed the largest volume because sustained satisfaction produces sustained deposits. and the propulsion chamber is now full. The countdown is in single digits, and the altitude the full chamber produces will exceed every ceiling the memory of the celebration was installing on the trajectory. The humiliation was preventing you from attempting. I know what the celebration did to the specific part of you where your willingness to be visible is stored, my beloved child. The fall itself was survivable. Falls happen. Trajectories are interrupted. Launch sequences are delayed by events the person on the pad did not anticipate. A fall without an audience produces pain the person processes privately. Grieving the interrupted trajectory, recovering the systems, preparing for the next attempt without the additional weight of knowing someone was watching the interruption and enjoying it. Your fall had an audience, and the audience applauded. My child, I watched what the applause added to the fall. The fall produced pain. The applause produced shame, and shame is a different compound than pain. Pain is processed in the body. Shame is processed in the identity. Pain says something happened to me. Shame says something was revealed about me. And the applause converted the pain of the fall into the shame of the fall by adding the specific "people saw this and were glad" quality that converts a private interruption into a public verdict. The public verdict said, "The fall confirmed what the celebrators always suspected about the trajectory." I watched the verdict install itself at the visibility layer, the specific layer where a person's willingness to be seen, to rise publicly, to occupy the altitude the trajectory was aimed at before the interruption is maintained. The verdict did not attack the desire to rise. It attacked the willingness to rise visibly. The desire remained intact beneath the surface. But the willingness to attempt the altitude in front of the same audience that celebrated the explosion was reduced by the shame the applause deposited on the visibility system. The desire to rise stayed. The willingness to be seen rising was damaged. And the gap between wanting to rise and being willing to rise visibly is the specific wound the celebration inflicted that the fall alone could never have produced. The wound is in the visibility, not in the capacity. The deepest wound the celebration produced was not the shame of being seen falling. It was the specific, private, never-voiced decision to keep the next launch invisible by staying at an altitude low enough that the same audience would never have the opportunity to celebrate another explosion from the same launch. Pad, my dear child, you made a decision, not consciously, protectively. The specific, "I will rise, but I will rise below the line where" visibility attracts the audience, that celebrated decision that a person makes when the memory of the applause becomes the governing data for how high the next trajectory is permitted to aim. The decision was not about limiting the capacity. It was about limiting the altitude to a height the celebrating audience would not notice, because unnoticed altitude cannot be publicly interrupted, and publicly interrupted altitude is what produced the celebration the decision was designed to prevent from recurring. You capped the altitude at the celebration line, and the capping has been governing every attempt since. My beloved child, I watched the capping produce its most devastating effect at the moment of the most recent opportunity to rise. There was an opening, a specific, real, this cold take you higher than you have ever been opening, that you approached with the specific. The last time I rose, this visibly the audience celebrated the fall. I cannot afford that applause again hesitation, that the celebration memory produces at the threshold of any altitude that would restore the visibility the applause taught you to avoid. The opportunity was real. The altitude was available. And the memory of the celebration stood at the threshold like a ceiling the capacity could exceed, but the willingness would not. My dear one, I watched you choose the lower altitude. Not because the lower altitude was what the trajectory was aimed at. Because the lower altitude was below the celebration line, and below the celebration line felt safer than above it. Because above the celebration line is where the audience can see, and seeing is where the applause lives. The safest altitude has been the lowest one. And the lowest one has been the most expensive. Type below the line if you capped your altitude at the celebration line. Choosing to rise below the height where visibility would attract the audience that celebrated the fall. And the most recent opportunity to reach higher was met with the hesitation the memory produces at the threshold of any altitude that would restore the visibility the applause taught you to avoid, meaning the safest altitude has been the lowest one, and the lowest one has been the most expensive because it costs the trajectory everything the capacity was designed to reach. The celebration line was never the ceiling of your trajectory. It was the fear response the applause installed on a propulsion systems whose designed altitude exceeds the celebration line by the entire distance between what the enemies expected the explosion to end and what the explosion actually ignited. My beloved one, I need to permanently separate the celebration line from the trajectory's design. Your system classified the celebration line as the maximum safe altitude, the highest the trajectory could aim without attracting the visibility that produced the applause. The last time the altitude exceeded the audience's comfort. The truth is the celebration line was the fear's ceiling, not the trajectories. And the fear's ceiling has no engineering authority over a propulsion system whose fuel volume was determined by the celebration the fear is trying to avoid repeating. The fear set the ceiling. The propulsion exceeds the ceiling, and propulsion outranks fear. My child, a rocket whose propulsion chamber is full does not negotiate with a ceiling installed by the memory of a previous launch's audience. The propulsion produces the altitude the fuel volume determines, not the altitude the fear permits, and the fuel volume in your chamber, deposited by every celebrator whose applause at the explosion was unknowingly adding to the thrust, exceeds the celebration line by a margin the fear cannot calculate, because the fear does not know the propulsion system exists. The fear is calculating from the memory. The propulsion is calculating from the fuel, and fuel outranks memory. My dear one, every act of faithfulness you performed while staying below the celebration line was not wasted by the capping. It was being converted into launch readiness by a system that was storing the fuel the celebrations were depositing, while the person on the pad was limiting the altitude the system was being fueled to exceed. The storing was happening during the capping. The readiness was building during the limiting. And full readiness at a full chamber does not produce a capped launch. It produces an uncapped one. The propulsion system just initiated the pre-launch sequence, and the specific systems activating, fuel pressurizing, countdown running vibration that the launch pad is producing beneath you right now is the first physical evidence that the full chamber is converting from stored fuel into active thrust for a launch, whose altitude the celebration line cannot contain. My beloved child, something shifted within the last few days, not in the circumstances, in the ground beneath the circumstances, the specific, almost imperceptible. Something is building beneath me. The platform is vibrating in a way it has not vibrated before. Tremor that a person standing on a launch pad produces when the propulsion system beneath them transitions from storage to ignition sequence, and the fuel that was being held begins pressurizing for deployment. The ground is vibrating, and vibrating ground means the sequence is running. My dear one, I need you to understand what happens during the pre-launch sequence of a propulsion system fueled by celebration. The fuel pressurizes, the chambers align, the thrust vectors are calculated, and the altitude trajectory is locked. Not at the celebration line the fear installed, but at the altitude the full chamber's volume produces when the propulsion converts the stored fuel into active thrust at the ratio the system was engineered to produce. The locked altitude is above the celebration line, far above, and far above is where the launch is aimed. I have been engineering the propulsion system behind every season of the capped altitude, while the fear was governing and the celebration line was limiting, and the memory of the applause was keeping the trajectory below visibility. I was at the chamber, pressurizing the fuel, the celebrations deposited, aligning the vectors, ensuring the thrust-to-altitude ratio would produce a trajectory that exceeds the celebration line by a margin that makes the celebration line invisible from the altitude the full chamber generates. My child, the margin is not slight. The margin is the entire distance between where the enemies expected the story to end and where the propulsion is about to carry it. Type ground vibrating if something shifted beneath the circumstances within the last few days. A tremor in the foundation, a vibration the platform has not produced before. And the vibration is the propulsion system transitioning from stored fuel to active ignition sequence, because the full chamber is pressurizing for a launch whose locked altitude exceeds the celebration line by the entire distance between where the enemies expected the story to end and where the propulsion is about to carry it. The enemies who celebrated your fall are about to witness your greatest rise. The title carries that specific sequence because the witnessing is not optional for the enemies, meaning the altitude the propulsion produces will be visible to the same eyes that watched the explosion. And the visibility is not incidental, but is engineered into the trajectory as a feature of the launch. The celebration fueled. My dear one, I need you to understand why the title says witness. The title does not say the enemies will hear about the rise, does not say the enemies will eventually learn what happened. Says witness. Witness is a visibility word, the specific. They will see it with their own eyes. The altitude will be undeniable from their position. They cannot avoid seeing what the propulsion produces, directness that the launch trajectory includes as a designed component of the rise the explosion ignited. They will see it, not hear about it. See it with the same eyes that watched the explosion. My beloved child, this is directly connected to the title and to the specific wound the celebration produced at the visibility layer. The title says greatest rise. Not a rise, not a recovery. Greatest, because the fuel volume the celebration deposited is producing the greatest altitude the trajectory has ever reached, meaning the rise the enemies will witness is not a return to the altitude the fall interrupted. It is an ascent past the previous altitude into a trajectory the pre-fall version never occupied. My child, the greatest rise does not return to the previous height. The greatest rise exceeds it, because the fuel the celebration added to the chamber exceeded what the pre-fall trajectory was carrying. The enemies did not merely restore the fuel the fall consumed. They added to it through their celebration. And added fuel produces added altitude. The altitude the enemies are about to witness is higher than the altitude they celebrated the interruption of, and higher than before, witnessed by the same audience, is the specific reversal the title was. The countdown just reached its final seconds, my beloved child, and the specific 3, 2, 1, fuel igniting, thrust deploying. The launch is no longer approaching but is happening right now sequence that the propulsion system is executing on a pad. The enemy is classified as a crash site, is producing the first visible thrust from a chamber whose full volume is about to convert into the greatest altitude the trajectory has ever generated. I need you to feel the proximity of the launch, not the distant "someday I will rise again," when the memory fades enough to try proximity, that the celebration line was producing as the default relationship between you and the altitude the capacity was designed to reach. The present tense, countdown at 0, fuel igniting, the explosion the enemies celebrated is about to become the explosion that launches proximity of a rocket whose propulsion is firing on a pad the audience thought was a permanent grounding site. The countdown is at 0, the fuel is igniting, and the pad is no longer a crash site. My dear one, everything has been building toward this ignition. The fall that was publicly witnessed, the celebration that converted the pain into shame, the shame that installed the ceiling at the celebration line, the capping that kept the altitude below visibility, the decision to rise invisibly rather than risk the applause recurring, the fuel being deposited by every celebrator whose enjoyment was unknowingly filling the propulsion chamber, the full chamber that reached maximum capacity, the pre-launch sequence that pressurized the stored fuel, and now the ignition. The specific, all-fuel deploying, full thrust producing, celebration line exceeding, greatest altitude generating, enemies about to witness ignition that is happening on a launch pad whose last visible event was the explosion the enemies applauded. My child, the last thing they saw was the explosion. The next thing they will see is the altitude. And the distance between the explosion and the altitude is the distance the propulsion converts from downward blast into upward trajectory. The blast just became the launch, and the launch is happening now. Type countdown 0 if the final seconds of the countdown just elapsed. The fuel igniting, the thrust deploying, the launch happening right now on a pad the enemies classified as a crash site. And the last thing they saw was the explosion they celebrated. And the next thing they will see is the altitude, the celebration fueled because the distance between the explosion and the altitude is the propulsion system, converting the downward blast into the upward trajectory. The enemies did not know they were powering. The rocket just left the pad. Thrust is active, and the trajectory that the enemies celebrated the ending of is now climbing past the celebration line at a speed the full chamber's volume is producing, visible to every eye that watched the explosion and classified the launch pad as the permanent resting place of a potential they resented and a trajectory they applauded the interruption of. My beloved child, this is the moment the crash site becomes a launch site. The moment the explosion the audience celebrated is retroactively revealed as the ignition the audience was fueling. The moment the altitude gauge begins climbing past the point the pre-fall trajectory occupied, and continues climbing past the celebration line, and continues climbing past every ceiling, the memory of the applause was installing on the willingness to rise visibly, because the propulsion system does not negotiate with ceilings, and the fuel volume does not consult the fear, and the thrust produces the altitude the fuel determines, regardless of what the memory is whispering about the audience. The altitude is climbing past everything, and everything includes the celebration line. The enemies who celebrated your fall are about to witness your greatest rise. The title said greatest. The altitude gauge confirms it. The title said witness. The visibility confirms it. And the enemies who applauded the explosion on a pad they classified as a crash site are now watching the same pad produce a launch whose altitude exceeds anything the pre-fall trajectory was carrying, because the fuel they added through their celebration exceeded the fuel the pre-fall trajectory contained. My child, they fueled this. Every applause was a deposit. Every celebration was a contribution. Every satisfied observation of the fall was fuel being poured into a chamber the observers did not know existed, and the chamber just deployed its full volume into a thrust whose altitude is being witnessed right now by the same eyes that watched the explosion and thought it was the end. The end just became the beginning, and the beginning is higher than anything the ending was interrupting. Now that the rocket has left the pad, and the altitude is climbing past the celebration line, and the enemies are witnessing the launch they unknowingly fueled, everything about the capped altitude, identity that governed your willingness to rise, visibly is being permanently dismantled by the evidence of a trajectory that exceeds the celebration line at a speed the fear's ceiling cannot contain. My dear child, this is what happens when a person whose visibility was capped by the memory of enemy celebration encounters an altitude that exceeds the cap without asking the memory's permission. The capping does not merely lift, it shatters, because the capping was sustained by the fear that rising above the celebration line would produce a second audience, and a second applause, and a second fall. And the altitude now being produced by the propulsion is climbing past the line at a velocity that makes the line irrelevant. The way a rocket climbing at full thrust makes a fence on the ground irrelevant to the trajectory, regardless of how real the fence was at ground level. The celebration line was a ground-level fence, and ground-level fences do not restrict rockets at altitude. My beloved child, the shattering is producing cascading effects across every area of your identity, where the celebration memory was governing your behavior. The visibility wound is being healed, because visibility at the altitude the propulsion is producing carries a different quality than visibility at the altitude the fall occurred at. The shame that converted the pain of the fall into the humiliation of the witnessed fall is being overridden, because shame operates at the altitude it was installed at, and the current altitude is above the shame's operating range. Shame has an altitude limit, and the propulsion just exceeded it, and the audience that celebrated the explosion is being permanently reclassified from the people who ended the trajectory to the people who unknowingly fueled its greatest launch. The reclassification changes the memory, and changed memory changes the ceiling. Type above shame's range if the celebration line just shattered under the velocity of a trajectory that exceeds the cap without asking the memory's permission. The visibility wound healing, the shame being overridden, because shame operates at the altitude it was installed at, and the current altitude is above its operating range, and the audience that celebrated the explosion is being reclassified from the people who ended the trajectory to the people who unknowingly fueled its greatest launch, because the reclassification changes the memory, and changed memory removes the ceiling. Let me show you what your life looks like now that the rocket is at altitude, and the celebration line is below, and the propulsion is carrying the trajectory past every ceiling. The memory was maintaining, because a person rising at full chamber velocity moves through the atmosphere at a level the capped version could never have accessed, my dear one. The first thing that changes is the relationship with visibility. You have been treating visibility as the threat, the specific. Being seen is where the applause lives. Altitude attracts the audience. The higher I go, the more exposed I become. Calculation. That the celebration installed as the default relationship between the trajectory and the eyes watching it. The calculation was accurate at ground level. The calculation is irrelevant at altitude. Altitude changes the relationship with visibility entirely. My beloved child, the mornings change permanently. You have been waking into the kept, the first conscious awareness of each day, running the familiar. Stay below the line. Do not attract the audience. Keep the altitude invisible protocol that the celebration memory was installing as the default morning operating system. Tomorrow you wake at altitude. The morning processes at a level the celebration line cannot reach, because the propulsion carried the trajectory past the ceiling during the night, and the ceiling is now below the position the morning is processing from. Altitude mornings carry uncapped potential. Capped mornings carried managed limitation. The opportunities ahead of you exist at altitudes the celebration line was preventing you from reaching. There are open doors and divine assignments positioned in the atmosphere above the line, doors whose altitude requirements exceeded the cap the fear was maintaining, and whose access was impossible, from a trajectory that was being governed by the memory of an audience that applauded at ground level. The doors above the line are now accessible, because the trajectory is above the line. And above-the-line doors open onto rooms the capped version never knew existed. People around you are going to notice the altitude before you describe the propulsion. Because a person rising at full chamber velocity past a celebration line that was governing their visibility for an entire season produces an atmospheric authority that the capped version could never generate, regardless of how much capacity the capped version was carrying beneath the ceiling. The fear was maintaining, my beloved child. The ones who knew you during the capped season, who interacted with the below-the-line version, who received the managed presentation, who experienced the specific quality of a person, my child. There is a specific quality a person carries when the propulsion of enemy celebration converts into the altitude the celebration was designed to prevent. The quality is not revenge energy. It is the specific. The explosion became the ignition. The fuel was their contribution. The altitude is the conversion reversal authority that a person produces when the very force that was aimed at keeping them grounded becomes the force that propelled them higher than the grounding could have ever imagined. The quality is propulsion-sourced altitude, and propulsion-sourced altitude attracts what capped trajectory limitation could not. Connections that require the specific atmospheric quality of a person whose enemies unknowingly fueled their greatest launch are approaching the altitude right now. There are alliances and assignments whose formation demands the specific, celebration-converted, explosion-propelled, above-the-line and climbing authority that only a person whose propulsion was sourced by the opposition's own contribution can carry. My dear one, what approaches propulsion-sourced altitude is calibrated to the reversal the conversion produced. And reversal-calibrated connections exceed anything the capped trajectory was encountering below the celebration line. Type propulsion sourced if the altitude is producing an atmospheric authority the capped version could never carry. The specific explosion became ignition. Enemies unknowingly fueled. The launch reversal quality that only a person whose opposition became their propulsion possesses, and connections requiring the specific weight of someone whose greatest rise was powered by the celebration of those who wanted the trajectory to end, are approaching because reversal-calibrated alliances were always positioned above the celebration line. The capped version was never permitted to reach. I need you to understand why I designed the propulsion system to convert enemy celebration into altitude, rather than shielding the launch pad from the celebration entirely. Because the design choice reveals something about the kind of rise I always intended for your trajectory, that a shielded, uncelebrated, unwitnessed launch could never have produced, my beloved child. I could have shielded the pad. The fall would have been private. The celebration would never have occurred. The shame would never have been deposited on the visibility layer, and the trajectory would have recovered from the interrupted altitude without the specific, enemy-fueled, celebration-converted, explosion-propelled quality that the unshielded fall produced in the propulsion system. The shielding would have prevented from being loaded. Shielded falls produce standard recoveries. Unshielded falls produce fueled launches. My child, a standard recovery returns the trajectory to its previous altitude. A fueled launch exceeds the previous altitude. By the margin, the fuel volume adds to the propulsion the standard recovery would have produced. And the margin between standard recovery and fueled launch is the margin the enemy celebration deposited, meaning the shielding would have preserved the trajectory at its original altitude, while the unshielding allowed the enemies to unknowingly fund an altitude the original trajectory was never carrying enough fuel to reach. The enemies funded what the original could not reach through their own celebration. My dear one, I chose you for the unshielded design because the assignment positioned at the altitude the propulsion produces requires a person who arrived there through reversal rather than through standard ascent. Reversal-arrived people carry a specific authority that standard ascent people do not. The authority of someone whose trajectory was publicly interrupted and publicly reignited by the force that intended the interrupting. You were given the unshielded fall because the altitude above requires reversal authority, and reversal authority is only produced by a publicly witnessed launch from a publicly witnessed crash site. The doubt surfacing right now is using the most humiliation-hardened objection in its inventory. The voice that says rising visibly means the same audience will be watching, and the same audience watching means the same celebration is possible, and volunteering for a second witnessed fall by rising above the celebration line is the specific risk the capping was designed to prevent. My child, it sounds like this. The first fall was survivable. The celebration of the first fall was barely survivable. A second fall, witnessed by the same eyes, celebrated by the same mouths, producing the same applause from the same audience, would produce a humiliation the system cannot process a second time. The altitude the propulsion is producing is attractive. But attractive altitude above the celebration line means attractive visibility to the same audience. And the same audience produced the same applause the last time visibility exceeded the line. That doubt just applied the vulnerability of the first launch to the propulsion of the second, and the two launches are not carrying the same system. My beloved child, the first launch was fueled by the trajectory's original supply. The original supply was limited. Limited fuel produces limited altitude. Limited altitude produces a fall whose recovery is standard. The second launch is fueled by the celebration itself, meaning the propulsion source is the opposition's own contribution, and the fuel volume exceeds the original supply by the margin, the celebration deposited. A rocket fueled by the original supply can fall. A rocket fueled by the volume the full celebration deposited reaches an altitude where the falling mechanics that governed the first launch do not operate. Because altitude fueled by converted opposition carries a thrust-to-weight ratio the original fuel could never have produced, and the ratio exceeds the threshold where the gravitational pull that caused the first fall can affect the trajectory. The first launch could fall. This launch cannot. because the fuel source changed, and changed fuel produces changed physics. Type changed physics if the doubt warned that rising visibly risks a second witnessed fall, and the distinction the doubt cannot account for is that the first launch was fueled by original supply, while this launch is fueled by the celebration's volume, producing a thrust-to-weight ratio that exceeds the threshold where the gravitational pull that caused the first fall can affect the trajectory, meaning the physics of this launch are different from the physics of the first, and what could fall at the original altitude cannot fall at the propulsion-sourced altitude. During every season, you were staying below the celebration line. I was not at mission control, observing the capped trajectory from a distance, while the person on the pad was managing the memory of the applause without the engineer's presence beside the managing. I was on the pad with you, my beloved child. Present at the altitude the capping was maintaining, carrying the knowledge of the full chamber beneath a person whose fear was governing the altitude. At a height, the chamber's volume was always going to exceed. You imagined a god who watched the celebration happen and then observed from the engineering level whether the person whose fall was applauded would eventually recover the willingness to rise. Without the engineer's direct involvement in the recovery of the visibility, the shame was suppressing. I was never at the engineering level during the capped season. I was on the pad, below the celebration line, with you, my child. Being on the pad with a person whose altitude is capped by the memory of enemy celebration, while knowing the propulsion chamber beneath them is full, is the most specific form of anticipatory presence the engineer produces. The engineer on the pad knows two things the person beside the engineer does not. The chamber is full, and the altitude is about to exceed the line. And carrying that knowledge beside a person who is governing their trajectory by the memory of an audience the engineer is about to make irrelevant, produces the specific, I am beside someone who does not yet know what is beneath them patience that the pre-launch season requires. There were nights during the capped season when the memory of the celebration replayed at its loudest, when the applause echoed in the system with the specific, they were glad I fell, they enjoyed my lowest moment, they celebrated what should have produced compassion cruelty that the replay carries every time the memory resurfaces at full volume. My dear one, on those nights the engineer was on the pad measuring the fuel the replay was producing, because even the memory of the celebration was depositing fuel, and memory-deposited fuel adds to the chamber the same way the original celebration did. I know the exact replay that produced the deepest shame, the specific night, where the memory of the celebration surfaced at a resolution so vivid that the person processing the replay experienced the applause as though the audience was present in the room, rather than present in the memory, producing the specific body level. I can feel them celebrating right now immediacy that a replay produces when the shame has been carried long enough to convert the memory from a past event into a present sensation, my dear one. Not the first replay, not the most frequent, the most vivid, the specific night where the memory crossed from recollection into re-experience. The threshold where the person processing the celebration is no longer remembering the applause, but is feeling the applause at the body level, as though the audience's enjoyment of the fall is happening in the current moment, rather than echoing from the past one. My beloved child, I know that replay, because the engineer was on the pad at the moment the re-experience crossed the now that the rocket is at altitude, and the celebration line is below, and the propulsion is carrying the trajectory past every ceiling the memory was maintaining. There is one thing I need you to do, my beloved child, and it is the instruction that determines whether the altitude the propulsion produced becomes the permanent operating level, or whether the memory of the applause reinstalls the celebration line at a height the trajectory has already exceeded. Rise visibly, not rise internally while managing the external presentation at the capped altitude the fear was governing. Not climb privately while keeping the public trajectory below the line the audience can see. Rise visibly at the full altitude the propulsion is producing, in front of every eye that watched the explosion, including the eyes that celebrated it. My child, rising visibly is the specific act that completes the conversion. The propulsion converted the explosion into altitude. The visibility converts the altitude into witness. And witness is the component that makes the reversal complete. Because a reversal that is not witnessed by the audience that celebrated the fall is a reversal whose full effect is limited to the person who experienced it, rather than extending to the audience whose celebration is being retroactively reclassified by what they are now seeing. The witness completes the reversal, and the reversal requires the visibility the fear has been preventing. When the visible rising begins, the memory will replay. The applause will echo. The celebration line will attempt to reassert itself at the altitude the fear was maintaining before the launch exceeded it. Respond to the replay with the altitude gauge. The gauge says the trajectory is above the line. The replay says the line is still the ceiling. And the gauge carries engineering data, while the replay carries emotional memory. Engineering data outranks emotional memory. Check the gauge, not the memory. The gauge says you are above every ceiling the memory was maintaining, and above is where you stay. You made it to the altitude, my beloved child, and I need you to stay at this height long enough to feel what it means to be rising above every ceiling the celebration installed on a trajectory the enemies believed their applause had permanently ended. Feel the altitude, not the applause, not the memory of the celebration that converted the pain of the fall into the shame of the witnessed fall. Not the celebration line that capped the trajectory below the visibility the fear was managing. Not the replays that deposited fuel at concentrations the shame's vividity was producing. The altitude, the specific propulsion-sourced, celebration-fueled, enemy-witnessed, above every ceiling, greatest rise of the entire trajectory altitude that is being produced right now by the controlled detonation of every drop of fuel the enemies deposited. When they applauded what they believed was the end of a story, the propulsion was always going to convert into the most powerful chapter. The altitude is yours, and yours feels like the opposite of everything the applause was teaching. I want to thank you for something the celebrated fall made almost impossible to sustain. Thank you for staying on the pad. Thank you for remaining on a launch site the audience classified as a crash site. While the chamber beneath you was being filled by fuel, the audience did not know they were depositing. Thank you for the capped season where the altitude was below the line, but the presence on the pad was maintained, because leaving the pad entirely would have removed the rocket from the propulsion system the celebration was loading. My dear child, thank you for not leaving the pad, because a rocket that leaves the pad before the chamber is full is a rocket whose propulsion never receives the fuel the full chamber requires. You stayed on a crash site while the enemies celebrated. And the staying is why the chamber reached full, and the full chamber is why the altitudes exceeds every ceiling the celebration was designed to install. Let the tears come, not shame tears, not applause tears, altitude tears. The tears of a person rising past the celebration line at full chamber velocity. undone by the discovery that the enemies who celebrated the explosion were unknowingly fueling the greatest launch of a trajectory they believed their applause had permanently grounded. Type altitude tears, if tears are forming right now, because the trajectory just exceeded every ceiling the celebration installed. And the tears are not the shame of the witnessed fall, but the reversal level overwhelm of a person discovering that the enemies who applauded the explosion were depositing fuel into a propulsion system they did not know existed, and the altitude now being reached by what they fueled is the greatest height the trajectory has ever occupied, and the greatest height is being witnessed by the same eyes that thought the explosion was the end. You are not the person staying below the celebration line anymore, my beloved child. That identity, the one whose publicly witnessed fall became entertainment for the people who resented the potential the fall interrupted, the one whose pain was converted into shame by the applause of an audience that enjoyed the lowest moment, the one whose visibility was capped at the celebration line by the memory of what happened the last time the altitude exceeded the audience's comfort, the one whose most vivid replay deposited the highest concentration fuel into a propulsion chamber. The person on the pad did not know existed beneath a launch site, the audience classified as a permanent crash site. That identity was permanently retired the moment the propulsion ignited and the rocket left the pad, and the altitude climbed past the celebration line and kept climbing past every ceiling the memory was maintaining, and the enemies who celebrated the explosion watched the same pad produce the greatest launch the trajectory has ever generated. You are the person at altitude now, and altitude changes everything the applause was teaching. The capped identity that governed your willingness to rise visibly, your relationship with the audience that celebrated, the shame that operated at the altitude it was installed at, the celebration line that functioned as a ground-level fence. On a trajectory, the propulsion was always going to carry past it, and the memory whose replays were depositing fuel the fear did not know was powering the launch. The fear was trying to prevent has been permanently exceeded by the evidence of an altitude whose height is proportional to the volume of fuel the celebration deposited. Meaning the people who celebrated the hardest funded the highest climb, and the highest climb is now being witnessed by the same eyes that produced the fuel the climb was powered by. My dear child, they celebrated too early. The title said it. The altitude confirms it. And too early is the specific miscalculation of an audience that classified an ignition as an ending without understanding the propulsion system the ignition was activating. From this moment forward, you carry the identity of a person whose God converts enemy celebration into propulsion altitude, not a person who stays below the celebration line to avoid the audience that applauded the fall. A person whose propulsion system was fueled by the applause itself, whose altitude is proportional to the volume of fuel the enemies deposited, and whose trajectory is above the operating range of the shame the celebration installed, and whose visibility at this altitude is the engineered witness component that makes the reversal visible to every eye that needs to see what they unknowingly powered. The rocket is at altitude. The celebration line is below. The enemies are witnessing. And the person whose lowest moment was applauded by people who wanted the trajectory to end is now occupying the highest point the trajectory has ever reached, powered by the fuel the applause deposited, propelled by the thrust the celebration produced, visible to the eyes that watched the explosion, and are now watching the altitude, and are now processing the specific. They celebrated too early. The explosion was the ignition. The crash site was a launch pad realization that what they contributed to through their celebration was never an ending, but the most powerful propulsion sequence the trajectory has ever received. Rise, my beloved child. The altitude is yours. The propulsion is theirs. The conversion is mine. And the God who designed the propulsion system to convert enemy celebration into trajectory altitude is the same God standing at the altitude gauge, confirming that the greatest rise of your entire life is being powered by the exact force that was meant to end it. Because rockets do not rise despite the explosion beneath them, but because of it. The explosion the enemies celebrated was always the ignition, and the ignition just produced the altitude. And the altitude is being witnessed right now by every eye that thought the explosion was the last thing they would ever see from this particular launch pad. They are seeing something else now, and what they are seeing is higher than anything their celebration was designed to prevent. Subscribe to this channel so that every time God converts enemy celebration into propulsion altitude, the launch announcement reaches you before the celebration line convinces you. The explosion was the ending. You are not a person whose trajectory was ended by the applause anymore. You are a person whose greatest altitude was fueled by the celebration of enemies who did not understand the propulsion system they were loading. The next message carries the first altitude report from above the celebration line, and what the trajectory produces when enemy-fueled propulsion reaches full altitude will prove that the crash site was always a launch pad, and the explosion was always the ignition, and the enemies who celebrated too early are about to witness the rise their celebration was always powering. Type launch from the crash site if you are leaving this message permanently changed. Knowing the fall was survivable, but the celebration added the shame installed the ceiling, but the ceiling was a ground-level fence. The memory deposited fuel, but the fuel loaded the chamber. The most vivid replay produced the highest concentration deposit. The chamber reached full, the countdown reached 0. And the God who designed the propulsion system to convert the downward blast into upward trajectory is confirming tonight that the enemies who celebrated your fall are witnessing your greatest rise right now, and the altitude being reached is proportional to the volume they deposited, and they celebrated too early, because the explosion was never the ending, but was always the ignition of the most powerful launch sequence your trajectory has ever